Peace in the Middle East, a spanking ban in Britain, and government bailouts for libertarian heroes. We'll discuss it all on the Compact podcast. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, Donald Trump, man of peace. That's the title of an article that Dan McCarthy published on the Compact site last week. I think McCarthy has really been one of the most, if not the most perceptive analyst of Trump's foreign policy in his second term. And McCarthy returns to an argument that he's made in earlier pieces for us connected to Trump's bombing of Iran, saying that Trump has really laid out a kind of foreign policy that is distinct from the realism and restraint school that you see promoted, on parts of the right and other sectors of, American opinion on the one hand, and distinct from kind of neoconservative interventionism on the other hand. So maybe you want to call that Jacksonian, or maybe you want to call it pragmatic. But McCarthy seems to think it's bearing some fruit. You guys optimistic, popping champagne about the developments we're seeing, or what do you make of it?
It's so odd, listening to the commentary, because on the one hand you have people who really, it's like I have this weird fascination and admiration for American exuberance and kind of like a long tradition of manifesting. So if you just sort of say something enough, it will come true, kind of a thing. And you could feel that with this like peace. We have peace in the Middle East. We're going to just keep saying this word peace. Not going to call it a ceasefire. Like this is it, peace. And it's like if we just say that enough, then we will really commit to it. And I honestly was like, yeah, let's just keep saying this is peace. There's no other option. And I got so annoyed when I was listening to the radio, and there was these, you people, you've been calling for a ceasefire all this time. You've been like telling us about all the awful toll that it's been taking on Palestinians, and you just want to call this a ceasefire. Well, it's not really a peace, is it? Da da da. And I'm like, I find myself taking Trump's side. Like, man, this is a win. Take it. Like, how much more blood do you really need to prove your damn point here? And I find this kind of the pragmatism that ultimately kind of, I suppose you could say, broke the deadlock is really admirable. It's like one step at a time, and Trump was like, okay, we're going to do this. And they're like, yes, but, and he's, no, you said yes to, this is Hamas. You're like, okay, you're going to release the prisoners. Yes, but no, that's it. You said yes, that's a win. We're going to take it. And we're going to get the but in the next step. And I felt like that was a really powerful way of actually doing it. You just would never be able to sit down and hammer it all out and have this utopian vision of what everything is going to be. But instead, to kind of take it step by step, I thought was really, really powerful. Now, of course, the naysayers are saying, well, look, it's all falling apart already within 24 hours. It's almost like they wanted it to, but we have to remember too, in famous peace agreements that have happened in the past, in Germany with the Good Friday Agreement, there was still violence after these agreements were struck. So it's not time to kind of lose hope and become pessimistic. But I think we must, commit to peace. This is, it's like you have to feel so horrible for the people living in Palestine, people living in the Palestinian territories, because their blood is not enough for Hamas. It's not enough for the people in the outside world who are desperate to use them, to hold up pictures of them mutilated, to destroy Israel. It's never going to be enough. And don't you just want to stop the bloodshed? Well, not if the Palestinians aren't at the table. Okay, yeah, all right, in a perfect world, but like, it's really like they flattened this whole damn area here. Take what you can get and let's move forward. I mean, you have to kind of hand it to Donald Trump for actually believing that peace is something that's worthwhile and worth moving forward on, and all in the name of business. Like, what are you guys doing here, wasting your time slaughtering each other? Let's make some deals. Let's make some money. I mean, I think that is a lot better than, you know, turning them, driving most of that population literally into the ground. So yeah, I don't know what it feels like over there, but I've been really kind of annoyed with. I've really admired the optimism and annoyed with people who want to downplay what's happened here. And even if the optimism is wishful thinking, I mean, like, I feel like we have to take what we can get.
So it's worth going back to the original proposal for peace and the reaction to that, which was largely, I'd say, dismissive or saw it as something of a feint rather than a serious plan. So it's worth noting that the people who thought that were proven wrong. That the assumption on the part of many mainstream, I'd say mostly left of center commentators, was this was a way to allow Netanyahu to kind of walk away from the table and just keep bombarding Gaza and eventually carry out his plans for annexation in Greater Israel. So this was an assumption I saw a number of people repeat, and of course it turned out to be incorrect. It's also worth going back to an earlier moment when this moment was kind of anticipated by this strange memeified version where, if people recall, back in February, I believe, Trump posted a video, an AI generated video that was supposed to represent the future of Gaza. And it was this strange and surreal representation of Gaza as this sort of, futuristic Gulf state paradise. And then you saw him and Netanyahu drinking beers on the beach. Very, very strange. But what's fascinating is that obviously that in itself has not come to pass, but nonetheless, it did prove to anticipate at least and a significant achievement that the previous administration was unable to bring about. And I'd say that, given the seemingly weird, sort of haphazard, and often, as Ashley said, not particularly kind of moralistic approach taken here, that this is really more about kind of deals and business and sort of hard-headed pragmatism, as well as Trump's egotism, his desire to have a Nobel Peace Prize. That
He
these
gave up
are,
on heaven, at
clearly
least.
sort of, there are clearly kind of what we would think of as sort of ignoble motives at work here, but nonetheless, it produced a result. And I'd say and I'm not the first to say this, but the people who this makes look the worst are people like Tony Blinken and Biden's entire experienced diplomatic foreign policy team that was, supposed to be charged with finding a resolution of this conflict. And so both Biden himself and the team of people who were really the kind of creme de la creme of foreign policy establishment insiders who staffed previously the Obama administration and then the Biden administration, really turned out to be, deeply unimpressive people and unable to really confront the reality. And I'd say this is true both in terms of their handling of Ukraine and their handling of Gaza, but particularly Gaza, because it's notable the degree to which they managed to alienate every faction with an interest in this conflict. They were regarded as equally despicable to both the most hardline pro-Israel people and the most hardline anti-Israel people. So really, by the end of the Biden administration, there was essentially no one who trusted them or saw them as capable of offering anything. And so this is really, I'd say, fundamentally another humiliation of the foreign policy establishment, that it ended up being, once again, Jared Kushner, who notably delivered the Abraham Accords in the first Trump term, which was a significant, sort of historic diplomatic breakthrough. And Steve Witkoff, who, somebody with no prior foreign policy experience, but nonetheless has actually achieved something. Regardless of how long this holds, it at least creates the opportunity for some sort of new starting point in what's a disastrous and tragic conflict. And so to that extent, it really does kind of vindicate. I don't think that this is vindicated in every area, certainly of Trump's administration this time or last time. And in fact, there are plenty of cases we could point to where it's led to rather poor results. But in this particular case, I think the basic premise of clearing out the dead weight of these insider establishment types of the sort of Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan sort, and essentially replacing them with sort of pragmatic, business-minded people who know how to do deals, is bearing fruit. And so at least I'd say this is a partial vindication of the basic, or at least part of the basic Trumpian sort of outsider populist ethos, that you can bring in people who are outsiders, who are not part of these hated establishments, and they will be able to achieve things that those people could not. And so this, again, I think should be taken as partial, not total vindication for that aspect of the Trump program.
There may be something to the argument that people who are trained in certain diplomatic practices are finally trained to sustain dialogues and continue holding meetings, and more to engage in a peace process than to arrive at peace. Maybe some analysis needs to be made of the difference between a kind of business logic and a kind of business kind of real estate deal maker logic, and a kind of diplomatic management of crisis logic. I mean, it's notable that Jared Kushner comes from a prominent New York area real estate family. Same with Steve Witkoff. Same, of course, with Donald Trump. So, yeah, I've read The Art of a Deal a couple times. It's probably not the great diplomatic text of the century, but I don't know, something these kind of New York guys who like to get deals done and cut through the red tape seem to be bringing something.
Of course, it's just like begging to be memed with that big Peace 2025 sign, like recalling mission. They're committed, right? Because that's like mission accomplished behind you. Like that is going to be everywhere the moment the poop hits the fan, as they say.
Absolutely. So Britain is considering a spanking ban. I see that the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health is urging the British government to outlaw the practice, and one representative has said now is the time for this Victorian era punishment to go. I mean, I think you could compare Britain as it is today to how it was in the Victorian era and think that there's been loss as well as gain. But and I guess I also thought when reading about this of Ernst Lubitsch's film Trouble in Paradise, when the hero says to the heroine, "If I were your father, which fortunately I am not, I would give you a good spanking." So that's kind of pre-code cinema, and such things would be strictly outlawed under the new regime in Britain.
Yeah, so to give us a little bit of context, corporal punishment in the home is already banned in Scotland and Wales, and I was involved in trying to stop that from happening. And I've been, I think probably it's been, 7 or 8 years that I've been involved in this debate. And it's England now, and there's a whole story to be told. And I wrote about this some time ago. I did this big investigation of this whole list that that these advocates produce, because it's not the Royal College of Pediatrics. It's not like somebody in a white lab coat being like, hey, I've done this research and I discovered that actually this produces negative results. It is advocacy research, and it's NGOs and advocacy groups, UNICEF and these sorts of people. And they're involved in sort of creating these like big lists of countries that have banned corporal punishment. And one of the tactics that they use, and you see this across different policies, and I believe I mentioned this on the podcast before, is that they go for weak points. So where they will go for countries where the pathway to policymaking is smoothest, typically where there's some kind of democratic deficit. So if you look at the list of countries around the world that have banned corporal punishment in the home, you have countries like Togo. And it's like, well, why would the people of this country be asking for a smacking ban? And we call it smacking, by the way, not spanking in the UK. So it's like a light swat on the back of the hand or on the back of the legs is usually what people use. Anything more than that, so it's in the law, it's called it's in English law, it is reasonable punishment. And it's a very clear bar that you are not allowed to cause anything more than transient lightening of the skin. Transient reddening of the skin. So it's just light smacks for the purposes of discipline. That's all that's allowed. You can't beat children. And it just recognizes that some parents will use this, regardless of what you think about it. That is just what the law says. And they want to get rid of that. So the countries that are around the world that have got rid of that include these sort of like random countries. Like why would people be asking for that when they're dealing with like childhood AIDS? And the answer is they're not asking for it. These advocacy groups will go in, and for instance, when there is an IMF bailout, one of the conditions, one of the strings attached will be things like UNICEF writes your children's code, and they will put in a ban on corporal punishment. And so it's things like that have happened. And so it's just like they're going domino. So then they go into Scotland and Wales, and they'll do this in Australia and New Zealand. These tend to be like quite easy targets. And then they will use that as a push. So once they got it in Scotland and Wales, because Scotland and Wales always want to be like the first to do something stupid, and they get in there, and now they're using that to push England. And they see that there is an opening, because nobody hates the working class more than Labour does. Nobody hates regular everyday people more than Labour does. I'm being hyperbolic. I really shouldn't, because it's quite serious. But this is an extremely illiberal government. You know, they're on the ball with digital IDs, this sort of thing, and it seems like the natural time. And so they've written a letter now to pressure Starmer's Labour to do something about it. Labour, for their part, seem to see which way the wind is blowing, and it is not in their direction. And they have said at the moment they're not considering it, but I think it's only a matter of time before these lobby groups are successful in their pressure, because they're always there looking for political opportunities. And you might say, well, like, what do I care? They're going to come for you next. Okay, they will use England once they get all of the UK. They will use that as a push for Canada. They will use that as a push for America. It is specifically named the worldwide. I can't remember the exact name of this group, but it's something like the worldwide effort to ban corporal punishment, something like that. So it's all around the world. So this matters. You're going to be in this debate too soon. So yeah, that's kind of what's happening, and I am against it because as much as these advocates want to lie and say you're assaulting children and how come I can't assault another adult, is a completely humongous difference between beating a child, which is the image you put in people's minds when you say assault, and swatting a kid on the back of the butt when they're out of line, which most parents do when they do it, very rarely and gradually phase it out by the age of 4. Now, you can disagree with that. I happen to not think it's the best way to raise children, but I also don't think that I want to be bringing the police around to people's houses because it's not the best way to raise children. We should not be using the police every time somebody says, I don't like that. I don't like that you do that. Okay, you can think that something is wrong, and it doesn't have to be illegal. And it is so hard to make that argument. This is probably one of the, I'm unpopular on a lot of issues, but this has got to be like one of the things that the left hates me the most for. And they all will come after me like, she says that we should beat our children. They have to make stuff up because there's like no sense of nuance there. It's like there's no difference between, I can say that this thing is wrong, but I don't think it should be illegal. And that when you bring the police into things, you create a lot more problems. And like, this should be illegal. I can't, people just can't make that difference. It's like, there ought to be a law. There ought to be a law. There ought to be a law against this. And we're creating a situation in which it is even more, first of all, it's a highly illiberal society, very authoritarian society. And it's even more difficult to raise children because you become more and more afraid of exerting your authority with your children. And even this idea of authority, and if I write about this, I would like to highlight this idea. I think what underlies a lot of the squeamishness around this form of parenting, because people know we're not talking about beating children. It is really a squeamishness about adults exercising their authority unrestrained by the professional. Because the professional class is all turned against this. They're like, no, we have discovered since the 1960s, American middle-class white parents are the best parents ever, and we should do exactly what they do, and anything else is bad parenting and child abuse. And so they've all turned against this. And so the people who are doing this, they are exerting adult authority in the name of tradition. And that is one of the biggest villains we have today, is this people who trust themselves and trust their own intuition. And that we can't have that. And I'll develop that idea a bit further, I suppose, if I write about it. But I think that's what underlies a lot of this squeamishness. And it's like this desire to save children because people have given up on the adult world, on convincing adults. They see sort of education of the next generation as really the only place where you can make a difference and make a change. And so the fight against tradition becomes this way of fighting for this roundabout way of fighting for progressive ideas, which have not convinced the adult generation. So become a kind of obsessively concerned with childhood. And there's a lot more reasons why we're obsessively concerned with childhood, but I think this is one of them, this kind of like frustrated liberalism that's given up on the ability to convince adults, sees children as the future, and wants to kind of break that relationship between the parent and the child, which is one of the last places they can't really get their hands into. I don't know, I'm being excessively, I think, cynical here. Maybe you can kind of challenge me and I can flesh out some of what I'm saying.
Well, I don't want to challenge you. Ashley, I think you're right to note that there is a class element here. Hearing your discussion of this spanking or smacking ban reminds me of a book, Natural Symbols, by the British anthropologist Mary Douglas. And in it, she talks about, at one point, about two kinds of response that a parent can give to a child when the child asks, why can't I? And, the response could either be, because I'm your father, or because I said so. Or it could be, well, if you lean over that railing, you could fall and then you would hurt yourself and I would be very sad. And those are really quite different responses, because the former is an appeal to authority and it is an assertion of social roles. And it really turns on the idea that the father or the mother, as the case may be, has the authority, and the child has the duty to respect and to obey that authority. And the second kind of response operates very differently. It's a kind of appeal to reason. It's an invitation to think through the consequences of one's actions. And as Douglas identifies, each response is more typical of a certain class, the former being more typical of working class people, according to her studies, and the latter, the appeal to kind of reasons and thinking through the consequences of one's actions. It's a more middle class or professional class response, and spanking, I think, more accords with the former kind of response to that sort of appeal to authority. And I guess I'll just add that I think that there is a simpler element in which this is a class issue. Working class people are more harried for time, and spanking is it's not a time intensive punishment in the way that, say, a timeout, or I'm going to take away this toy, or I'm going to talk things through with you and try to calm you down that way. It's less about managing the child, I would say. So, yeah, I do think they're really you're proposing to outlaw a particular kind of parenting, and it's going to fall mostly on a certain class, class of people who have a harder time already in terms of finding the time to care for their children and raise them. And I wonder how humanistic it really is.
Oh, it's, and you know that you'll never find anyone to argue against this on the left, because nobody hates working class people more than so-called communists. It's like it sort of feeds into this idea that Geoff and I have been talking about on blame theory, where there's this sort of like underlying eugenicist ideas where it's like, well, if you haven't got the time to raise your children properly, maybe you shouldn't be having children at all. But there's, this, obviously, when you bring the police into something, you are inviting the police to come down hard on who they always come down hard on, and that is the poor and the working class, ethnic minorities. Like, what did you expect was going to happen? And this is what's happened in Scotland and Wales and Ireland, where they have outlawed it. It's immigrants that are getting accused, and if you're accused of assaulting your child, they don't leave you with your kid. Oh, you assaulted your kid. Okay, have a good day. We'll investigate. No, they separate the family during the investigation. That family gets broken up. You don't have to be convicted for this to destroy your life. So I could tell awful stories, but I'm not going to go into it. But yeah, there's a class element to it. Obviously, it's looking down on the working class and the way that they raise their children, and seeing that as causal in terms of why they are working class and why they are poor. And there's a global dimension to this as well, because UNICEF is constantly producing these statistics that say 70 to 90% of African children are abused by their parents, which you would never say in any other. You would never say. Basically, 70 to 90% of African parents are child abusers, but you can say that or violent criminals. But you can say that in relation to them as parents, and it's fair game.
Yeah, I mean, the studies about the kind of bad effects of spanking often say something like your household. If you were spanked as a child, you're 20% more likely to be involved in a violent encounter as an adult or something. So.
Which is impossible to disentangle from class.
Yeah, if you're in a working class community, you're going to be more exposed to violence. It's like if you wear a wife beater and a gold chain, you're 20% more likely to be a member of the Italian mafia. It's just sort of kind of like just trading in these stereotypes and just it's just totally kind of circular reasoning, and there's no real proof of causality that I've ever seen.
No, it's correlative and so on, and they claim that they can control for these things, but it is absolutely impossible. There are no monocausal phenomena in society, and you absolutely cannot trace like a swat on the back of the bum to future criminality and disentangle that from the entire milieu where that is more common.
Yeah, it's a bit reminiscent for me of controversy around Kamala Harris's record when she was district attorney of San Francisco, because one of the things she did was pursue parents around the issue of truancy, which was essentially kids skipping school. And so and this was in the name of a kind of equity agenda that what you did to make sure that all kids were being given the same opportunities was, if their parents were letting them skip school, you lock the parents up. And so, this was sort of, I guess, a respectable part of her record that I think she boasted about at certain points. But then in the course of the racial reckoning, it became more problematic. And eventually the left kind of turned against it and would bring it up as that when there were kind of the left arguments of like Kamala as a cop, this was one of the main things that was brought up. So it's interesting because I suppose it's another example of where these kind of supposedly kind of social justice oriented, like equity driven policy approaches end up essentially using the state to persecute the working class and the sort of racialized poor. And so it creates these kind of coalitional problems within the left, where they're supporting policies that end up leading to, essentially police locking up, the very people they claim to be defending and standing for. So, clearly, the other thing I was thinking about in relation to this is like my, friends from Latin America or from, Latino backgrounds, is like everybody associates the word chancla, which means like flip flop or sandal, basically with, with kids getting spanked. It's like a standard mode of discipline in this culture that, your mom like picks up the chancla, the flip flop, and, that's supposed to kind of stop you in your tracks. And so like this stuff is so, it's so connected to these cultural differences that, there's no way that if you pursued this in this kind of legislation in the United States, it would end up having an extremely racially disproportionate, ethnically disproportionate impact. And it would end up, again, like with Harris's, prosecution of parents for truancy would end up probably producing some sort of internal backlash, because that would be so obvious. But, the other thing that strikes me here is like, isn't the left supposed to be influenced by Foucault? I mean, this seems like, I like if you read Discipline and Punish, okay, I'm not sure Foucault like actually thought it would be cool to bring back, public dismemberment of criminals. But, the not so subtle message of Discipline and Punish is, yeah, there were kind of good things about that as compared to this much more insidious, diffuse, panoptic mode of the exercise of power that we have in the modern world. And so, I think I will confidently say Foucault would have been against smacking bans or spanking bans, because clearly what it does is it expands the panoptic reach of the state and its disciplinary power. And, that just clearly was something that he wanted to resist. So I don't see how, of course, he was also kind of into S&M, so that's another aspect of it. But, I don't see, it's one of these things where I'm like, the sort of the insidious logic of this type of policy is so clearly laid out in Foucault's work that it's just bizarre that, ostensibly he's like this figure who's, so influential on the left's thinking, but in fact, they seem to have absorbed basically nothing from him, because if they had taken anything from Discipline and Punish, they would not be attacking Ashley for saying that smacking bans are bad.
Yeah, and in fact, I was just talking about this the other day, and someone said, "Is Ashley a secret Foucauldian?" And I was like, "People you don't read, like." Like this is I detect some Foucauldianism. Really shocked, but no, of course. And this is and also I think it is you are supposed to socialize your child into this new form of discipline, which is not overt and visible. It is quiet and psychological. Like I use the naughty step on my kids, and I feel terrible about it because it was like 2 minutes of utter psychological torture. It would have been much better if I'd have just given them a smack on the back of the butt and given them a hug and said, "Mommy loves you, and I'm sorry that I have to tell that's the boundary. We don't cross that boundary," like my parents did for me. Instead, they had to sit there and think about what horrible little children they are for 2 minutes, but anyway, you do have to make your kids feel bad. That's
so
really
the naughty step,
it,
I guess, is what I would call timeout. Basically, go sit somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, I call it timeout too, but I don't know why when I speak publicly. Even my dog, if I say I'm going to give you a timeout, the dog will go into the bathroom. Like the dog will give itself a timeout. That's how effective it was.
Be careful, Ashley, with talking about the dog, because the left-wing streamer Hassan Piker has received blowback for allegedly using a shock collar on his dog. So yes. I hope you have only.
I never timed out my dog. That's the thing. He just figured it out.
So you say. I hope you don't end up in the Hassan Piker dog cancellation spiral. He's just going around saying as many outrageous things as he possibly can, but the dog allegations are what's finally going to bring him down. So it goes in 2025. So it looks like Trump, he's ready to help Argentina. We've offered the country, which is led by the libertarian Javier Milei, a $20 billion bailout. Trump told reporters that he's, quote, just helping a great philosophy take over a great country. Presumably that's Milei's laissez-faire outlook. And Trump has warned that if Milei loses the elections, then the U.S. guarantees of money are going away. So, I guess this is libertarianism in action. Just promises of billions of dollars from an overseas government is needed to prop up the great free market orthodoxies of Milton Friedman. Well, what's the libertarian explanation for why this isn't just a huge embarrassment for their kind of Reddit ideology?
Well, I suppose I would recommend people check out Juan Rojas's piece on this from a few weeks ago when the bailout was first floated, called "Trouble in Libertarian Paradise" in Compact, where he sort of argues that the current state of things in Argentina isn't. And Juan is not exactly a sort of libertarian sympathizer by any means, but the current state of things in Argentina is not necessarily to be taken as kind of an indictment of Milei's specifically libertarian policy orientation, because in some ways Milei, despite seeming extremely radical in his outlook, he claims to be an anarcho-capitalist, which is a remarkable thing to be if you're going to be a president of a sovereign nation. But nonetheless, he sees no contradiction there apparently. But Milei did not really pursue the most radical version of the agenda that he promised and proposed on the campaign trail, which involved getting rid of the Argentine central bank, getting rid of the peso, adopting the dollar as the currency, and basically doing away with the entire sort of, I suppose, kind of sovereignty and autonomy of Argentina as a sort of monetary entity. And so he hasn't done that. Instead, he's actually retained a sort of continuity with previous Argentine governments in keeping the peso pegged to the dollar, which, as Juan explains, is sort of an attractive proposition politically in various ways, but also carries with it all kinds of problems. So people can check out Juan for a deeper account of that. But the point is that Milei has been, in fact, less radical as a libertarian than his policy proposals and sort of campaign would have suggested, and instead has really, he's pursued a kind of austerity driven agenda, cutting back government. Of course, he's famous for wielding a chainsaw in public appearances. And so he has done that. He's, cut various regulations. Ironically, in terms of Trump's own agenda, he's also cut tariffs. He's cut, all kinds of limitations on foreign trade. And this, I suppose, is the most kind of bizarre and interesting thing about this whole alliance and Trump's praising of Milei's great philosophy, which is that if you look back at the history of Austrian libertarianism as a sort of economic philosophy, people can read Quinn Slobodian's Globalists on this subject. It really began as a political project, as a campaign against the tariffs that were imposed in the wake of the First World War. That there were implementation of tariffs across much of the world, in contrast to the free trade order that had prevailed prior to the First World War, under the sort of gentle rule of the British Empire. And then after the First World War, there was a surge in nationalism. There was the Wilsonian principle of national self-determination. And along with this went various attempts to kind of insulate and protect national economies. And so the Austrian tradition really is invigorated as a political project in the fight against tariffs during the 1920s and 1930s. And so there's almost nothing more at odds with Austrian economics than tariffs. I mean, there are other bugbears and things that it's been dead set against since its origins, but tariffs are pretty close to their original sort of bête noire. So the irony of Trump really representing a political shift towards the reassertion of national sovereignty and of political sovereignty as the kind of final deciding force behind the economy is fundamentally in conflict with any sort of Austrian philosophy, with this great philosophy that he is praising in Millet. So Millet it's not that he has actually, set out to dissolve the sort of monetary sovereignty of Argentina as he promised to do. But nonetheless, in philosophical terms, these two visions, it's hard to imagine two visions more at odds with each other. But on one level, we can just read this as sort of vibes. Populism is really about vibes. When I've pointed this out online, people will be like, well, some countries need tariffs and other countries need free trade or something like that. But I mean, this doesn't make sense because the whole point of free trade is that it is a global paradigm. It's not something some countries, if that's what you believe in, if you believe in the Austrian understanding of free trade, then it does not, you can't have free trade in one country, to borrow from Stalin. That's a contradiction in terms. It is fundamentally a sort of global paradigm, and it only works if it works everywhere. And so these visions aren't really reconcilable, but nonetheless, the vibes are highly convergent. And so that seems to be the most important thing. As far as the current state of Argentina, in some ways I would argue it's really just a continuity with the various dysfunctional governments that have run the country for the past couple decades or more. And really, Argentina has just never resolved the basic contradictions of its economic system and orientation. And people like Millet will, and this goes back really to, as I said, the pre-First World War era of global free trade, the time when everybody was kind of directly or indirectly under the gentle rule of the British Empire. And Argentina was very much a sort of unofficial part of the British Empire for much of the 19th and up to the early 20th century. And really its wealth and prosperity, which people like Millet will say, was simply the sort of natural order of things before these evil communists, as he called them, came in and sort of ruined everything. In reality, Argentina was wealthy and successful when it was integrated into the global trade regime overseen by the British Empire. And it was a crucial commodity exporter at the time. And then, because that whole global order in which it thrived fell apart, it has struggled to redefine itself. It's attempted to redefine itself as a more sort of autarkic or sort of regionally integrated industrial power. And for a while, it did industrialize. And then it, subsequently in the late 20th century, kind of tried to reintegrate itself into this global order. And that, led to this kind of hyper financialization of the economy and a huge crash in in the late 90s, and then it sort of reemerged as a sort of major, attempting to be a major regional player, but really reliant on commodity export to China, and increasingly exporting soybeans, especially to China, became the kind of central economic activity, and that's kind of where we still are today. It's essentially a kind of major commodity exporter, especially to China and Asia. And I think the more the less kind of ideological and or vibes based nature of what the Trump administration is doing really just has to do with trying to jostle for influence with China in South America and Argentina, because it's, even if the ideologies seem at odds, it's sort of simpatico and in a vibes-based way with the Trump administration. It's obviously a relatively large economy that you want to have oriented towards the United States rather than towards China. Of course, the problem with this is that, America also has soybean farmers, and so American soybean farmers and Argentine soybean farmers are both trying to sell the same goods on the global market. And it's not clear that, however much love Trump and Milei might have for each other, or however much Trump might admire Milei's philosophy, that's going to help resolve that basic conflict of interests.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably just echo a lot of what you've said. I mean, I couldn't go into as much depth, but the irony is, I mean, fairly obvious that his campaign rhetoric is all about freeing sort of like emancipation from bureaucratic control. But now his government is supervised by one of the most bureaucratic institutions on earth. So you wind up being even more bound to foreign oversight. But that's always the case with neoliberalism, that the end point of it is submission to some kind of rule-based order. That you are only, quote unquote, free when you're behaving predictably within a kind of bureaucratic framework. And that's, all of the frontline libertarianism is always constrained by an economic logic that says you have to be predictable, follow these rules. And now you have a bailout that will stimulate them by a foreign power. It's over and over and over again, the same story.
Thanks, Ashley. Thank you, Geoff. And thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.